夠鐘又夠。
Members, it's time and we have a quorum. Let's invite the administration and deputations in. Today we have 33 deputations here, as well as individuals. The meeting should last till about 4:45 p.m. With 3 minutes each, the speaking time will be close to 100 minutes in total, and after that, the floor will be open for questions from members. At 4:30 p.m., a number of members have to attend a meeting in another room on the Medical Council Ordinance, and so by then I will hand over to the Vice Chairman to preside over the meeting. First of all, let's welcome the administration in. Today we have Mr. Michael Wong, Permanent Secretary from Development Bureau, Mr. Thomas Chan, Deputy Secretary, Ms. Celine Choi, Deputy Secretary, as well as Mr. Tony Mo Yung, Assistant Director from the Lands Department. Welcome.
首先歡迎各團體代表。
I'd like to welcome deputations and individuals. If needed, you can use your headphones and speakers. Channel 0 is for Channel 1 Cantonese, Channel 2 English, and Channel 3 Putonghua. I'd like to invite deputations that you will have a time slot of 3 minutes each. If you have written submissions, you can hand them over before or after the meeting. Please note that your speeches and written submissions will not be protected by the Electoral Powers and Privileges Ordinance. Please also notice the note for members of the public attending meetings in conference rooms or observing meetings in public galleries in the electoral complex. The note has been attached in the bundle distributed by the Secretariat. Members of the public in the public gallery can also obtain a copy of the note from the electoral security staff. I will invite deputations to speak based on the order on the seating plan. After that, the administration will provide a response. First, from the Lok Ma Chau Hong Kong Freight Association, Mr. Chang Chi-wai. Thank you. On the Hong Shou Kiu development, and on the government's proposal to compensate the trade on certain conditions, we hope that the investors in need can really benefit. We have very complicated stakeholders in the new territories, and hopefully the government can grasp the situation. In past consultations carried out by the Development Bureau, we have made it clear that apart from compensation to those affected, the trade is interested in how they can continue to operate. That's of top priority for us. Can the government refer to the study on the Hong Shou Kiu development area published by the Planning Department in September last year? and 37 hectares of land has been allocated for logistics, and another 27 hectares as backup areas. The government should be responsible of building such facilities and workshops. And these workshops and facilities should be let out to affected operators in the area so that affected operators can continue to do business. So this is something we want to see. Hopefully the government can consider that. Can the government consider changing the use of abandoned private agricultural land? In the next few years, there will be major changes at boundary crossing points at Long Ma Chau, Mangam To, and Sha Tau Kok. The freight access or channels would no longer allow freight vehicles after the BCP's commission, and the Shenzhen Bay is likely to implement a 24-hour freight access. So the Hong Shui Kiu development would resume a lot of backup areas. So these facilities or arrangements are imminent. In terms of the available land lots, the government should do something. Thank you. Next, from the Civic Party, Mr. Tam Ka Chun. Good afternoon. Facing scarce land resources in Hong Kong, it's inevitable that the government would afford priority to brownfield sites.
We've been asking the government to look at the site from a brown site user-friendly perspective, and in this case, I think they are paving the way for the resumption of land in Yuen Long and Hong Shui Kiu, and that would also be in line with the administration's approach of completely resuming brownfield sites. And on the other hand, that would also offer a reasonable way out for the logistics industry. But then, concerning brownfield sites, would the government be compensating these subtenants as well? Because in terms of actual practice, will the ex-gratia payment be able to help the trade to really go upstairs, or would they be compensated so that they can close their business? Well, we have two suggestions here. First, with regard to short-term tenancy sites, well, very often the Lands Department would offer a short-term tenancy to those who have occupied the agriculture sites, and the Ombudsman has criticized the practice. And if the administration still adopts that practice, that is for these occupiers who have occupied farmland without authorization, I think that would amount to condoning to such irregularities. And also, if they are paving the way for the new development area in Hong Shui Kiu and so on, taking Hong Shui Kiu as an example, well, out of the many hectares of land available, some 46% of them would be brownfield sites. And if you look at the in situ land exchange and so on and so forth, I think it's very clear that so long as they are able to meet certain requirements, for example, they are commercial operations, so they have the right to ask for land exchange. That being the case, so for those landlords or developers who have hoarded land, will they be able to get compensation, which is about 3 or 4 times of the site's value? Then they would also be able to get development rights. Okay, this is a farmland, but then it has been turned into a residential site and also a commercial site without the need to pay any premium. I think that would amount to collusion between the government and the business sector. Originally, you're trying to compensate the farmers, and originally, since it's been zoned farmland, I think they should only offer the value of farmland in resuming farmland. Only then would that be in line with the established policy. Next, from the DAB, Mr. Lam Chi Young. Mr. Lam, thank you, Chairman. Well, the DAB supports the rezoning of brownfield sites, and we should also set aside land to meet the needs of our society. And to time with this policy, we support the ex-gratia payment or allowance policy because, well, the existing compensation policy would be made fairer and more reasonable, and also that would minimize the impact on the operators, and that would also make the whole process a lot smoother. Well, under the proposed arrangements, we have the following suggestions. First, we expect that the Bureau will be able to relax the arrangements so that there can be stepped up publicity. In particular, they should go to the sites to publicize this, and there should also be detailed briefings for those affected, and when necessary, adjustments should be made in order to tie in with the actual situation on the ground. And for those who are eligible, initial registration should be done for them. Second, we suggest that the whole process should be streamlined so that the allowance can be offered more expeditiously, and also they should also broaden the scope of those eligible in order to reduce or minimize disputes. Third, I believe that for the operators on the greenfield sites, other than the existing EGA, when they try to identify alternative sites for removal, I think it's more important because I think to them, it's better to be able to continue to operate elsewhere than having to close their business. That's why the administration should look at how these clearees and operators to identify alternative sites so that they can be relocated. And also, while the administration is looking at the Hong Shui Kiu development plan, there should be multi-story building for the relocation of these brownfield sites operators so that they can go into those multi-story buildings. But then under the NT-North development plan, they are already starting the resumption of land, and therefore many operators will not be able to wait till after the completion of these multi-story buildings. That's why for many of these operators, we propose that other than offering them with EGL, the administration should listen to their needs. And then in the NT Northeast development area or elsewhere, multi-story buildings should be built in order to relocate these affected operators, and sites should also be set aside for small workshops, for example, metal workshops, and also car repair workshops, so that they can continue to operate. Thank you. Next, Ocean First Logistics, Mr. Chow. Thank you, Chairman. Well, under the Hong Shui Kiu development plan, the administration is offering EGA to the landlord and also the operators. So compensation would only be offered to these two parties. But then in Hong Shui Kiu, there are many who are playing the role of intermediaries. For example, they might have built logistics warehouses, or they might have built certain facilities, and then they would sublet those facilities to the operators. So the occupiers are actually tenants of these facilities. So when it comes to the EGA, I hope that these intermediaries should be eligible. And also they talk about the 10-year rule before anybody would be eligible. We are very unhappy about that, because what we are suggesting is that, well, on the 18th of April 2017, the administration conducted this freezing survey, and on that particular cutoff date, if there have been no prosecution notices issued against a particular party, he or she should be eligible. And also for open-air storage, well, the maximum would be 5,000 square meters. We are most unhappy about that because in different trades, their needs might be different. For example, for those of us running container yards, well, very often we have a size of 10,000 or more square meters. But then if the compensation would only be offered to operation for less than 5,000 square meters, then we would be getting a lot less. And also, in September 2016, the Planning Department has already set aside some 37 hectares of land for logistics and also some 30 hectares of land for backup facilities. In fact, for those of us who have been affected, we should be allowed to relocate to these areas. Last but not least, in the new territories, if we were to identify suitable sites for relocation, the Planning Department should relax the rules so that we should be allowed to continue to operate. Thank you. Next, from the Liberal Party Youth League, Mr. Ma. Good afternoon, Chairman. Well, for the clearance operations, operators on the affected sites would be offered EGA, and we'd like to express our views on this. My apologies.
你講完係咪？
Have you finished? My apologies. I got the wrong paper with me.
講完你睇下可唔可以揾翻你個文件出嚟好嘛？
唔該，主席。
下一位係海思機械設備有限公司總經理蘇子豪先生。
係，多謝。喂，係。我想講多少少關於10年嗰個問題啊。咁我睇個文件咧，就佢嗰度講點解10年以上先有咧？即係佢嗰度呢個理由就係因為10年以下嗰啲經營者咧就會涉及較少嘅硬件。
For less than 10 years, then it would involve less hardware investment, and therefore the impact on them would be less significant. What I'd like to say is that for those of us who have been operating there, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years, the initial capital investment would be no different. So on paper, if you just draw the line at the 10-year operations, I think that's very subjective and arbitrary. Well, as Mr. Charles said, well, should we be imposing this cut-off date? I think that would be better. Thank you. Next, Mr. Leung Fuk Yuen. Thank you, Chairman. All right, I have 6 to 7 points to make about this EGA policy. Well, early this year, the Planning Department spent over $10 million to appoint a professional consultant to conduct a comprehensive study on brownfield sites. And according to their study, they're looking at the definition of brownfield sites, the types, and also the size of these sites, and so on and so forth. Well, with the comprehensive survey, they tried to interview each and every operator and person in charge. And I think that on the EGA offered by the administration, that should be done in accordance with the findings of the survey earlier this year in order to understand the operations on each and every site. And that should also form the blueprint for the consultation and offer to be made by the government. For example, on the compensation, for example, how many years have they been there, and also who should be eligible, and also the amount of compensation, and so on. In fact, there are 3 main types of operations which would be eligible, including those operating on private farmland, the owners, and also the occupiers who have been operating there for no less than 10 years. So that's the system imposed by the administration. You'd have to be there for at least 10 years. And they would also have to be approved by the administration before they would be eligible. And for those who have occupied the site for 10 years, and at the same time, they've also obtained the permit from the Lands Department. So these are very strict and harsh rules, and that would not be able to reflect the hardship of the operators. And I don't know whether or not the Development Bureau had the data, for example, for the 3 types of operations that were mentioned. What about the larger warehouses? And if the amount of compensation is so little, well, how can that be acceptable? And also for the years of operation and so on, the administration has already made the announcement, and I think that would be very difficult to resolve. Well, according to my understanding, many of the open-air workshops, they will have to have short-term waivers and so on. And for how long the items have been stored there? Well, from time to time, there might be changes, and therefore the situation would be rather complicated. So I hope that that should be reduced to 3 to 5 years before anybody is eligible. I think that would be more reasonable. Also, who should be eligible for the EGA? Well, at the time of resumption, in order to reduce the disputes, you should refer to the report, and you should also conduct more survey on the ground. Next, Mr. Chen from a recycler. Well, our company has been working in Hong Kong for some time, and in Hong Shui Kiu, we have a site of some 20 hectares of land is used for recycling and warehousing. Well, looking at the paper for the 10-year rule, well, as you understand it, the Hong Kong recycling industry has been working in very difficult environment, and we have no idea as to how long we can survive. All right, you said that we had to be there for at least 10 years before we would be eligible, but then we couldn't even tell whether or not we can survive for another year. And also, on this occasion, we hope that the government and the planning department can work with us to identify more sites that can be used for recycling, so that we can be relocated there. In fact, we don't really want to get the EGA. We'd like to continue to operate so that we can contribute to the green industry. Next, Mr. Kong Hong San. Thank you. Good afternoon, members. Well, my company started this business in the 90s, and we've been working in the logistics industry.
咁對於呢個受政府發展清拆行動影響嘅業務經營。
As for the ex-gratia allowance arrangement for business undertakings affected by the government's development clearance exercises, I am dissatisfied with the terms. The requirement of operation on private agricultural land not in breach of the lease conditions should be revoked unconditionally. And the paper did not explain how to prove the period of operation and the definition of continuous operation. The logistics trade constantly changes in terms of modal operation based on market developments. Right now, a lot of facilities are owned by an investor and managed by a logistics company. If the requirement is to mandate operation on the private agricultural land lot for more than 10 years, it would be hard to define. And in the last 3 or 4 years, our new logistics warehouses made leaps and bounds in terms of material and building technology, and we have a lot of certificates of satisfaction, etc. And even though we have not operated for a very long time, it doesn't mean that the capital and hardware we put in are not substantial. And the short-term investors actually make the greatest losses. If the government only compensates operators who have been in business for more than 10 years, then a lot of SMEs in the trade will make great losses. The government's land policy is too conservative and inflexible, and it cannot meet market needs. In order to meet market demands, operators are forced to develop against the land lease conditions, and the legal economic activities on the structures or in the structures are inevitable. Our activities can drive the economy and provide affordable and cheap services to the public, but the government is not compensating unauthorized structures, and this is not reasonable. My name is Chen Kwok-chi. I'm a landlord at Macho Long, and the government announced a green policy, and our sawmill was suspended. Right now, the current operator is a tenant, but neither the factory owner or tenant are eligible for the EGA. If the government wants to resume the land, they could not reach an agreement with the owners, and after that they implemented the EGA arrangement, and the EGA compensations do not respect the wishes of the operators, and very few owners could receive the EGA. The affected factories or landlords expect reasonable compensation as well as reasonable reprovisioning by the government. The landlords are also licensees, and the self-constructed, self-built structures should be incorporated into the EGA arrangement. Next. Ms. Ngao Yang Wei Chi from Yatong. Or Harvest Hill Hong Kong Limited. The requirement of 10 years of operation seems rather long. After the 10 years are up, we do not know when the qualification or requirement would be surrendered, so the period should be shortened. Next, from Taketo Company Limited, Mr. Chiu Chi-chun. Thank you. As a user, we hope to continue our business in situ or at least in the same district. Thank you. Next, from Chensheng Logistics ASC Worldwide Limited, Mr. Lo Ai-seng. We are a logistics company since 1990. We have been in the village for 3 or 4 years. For each warehouse, we invested substantial resources. We used to use industrial buildings or logistics warehouses by big developers. We moved into the lower village because rent has gone up constantly in the last 4 or 5 years. And we were facing rental increases up to 200 or 300%. So we hope that the developed area can consider the assets and situation of an SME like us. You should not have a clear-cut approach. You should tell us the arrangements clearly. The government has never given us a clear compensation or reprovisioning plan. We never know about the arrangements, procedures, or timeline. For the Hong Shui Kiu new development area, it accommodates a lot of warehouses and open areas, and hopefully we can be allowed to continue at nearby agricultural land lots. We have been talking about rehabilitating agricultural land lots, but is that the reality? The government should be realistic and see whether there are any farming operations at the private agricultural lands. Hopefully this can promote Hong Kong's GDP and economy. Thank you. Next, Ms. Law Wing Yin from Chun Sing Logistics Hong Kong Limited. I'm also in the logistics trade. If we can implement in situ reprovisioning, if our vehicles can unload in the same area, even if you have multi-story buildings, can you allow the vehicles to reach the loading and unloading base directly? If you are to provide compensation, if we cannot continue to operate, we would feel that we are exploited. We want to continue, but can the government help us in terms of rents and reprovisioning? And Mr. Teng Shilun from Talent Convergence Limited. Thank you. In the compensation document for Hong Shui Kiu, the government only talked about the compensation for operators, investors, or landlords, and the government missed one stakeholder, and that is the intermediaries. The land ownership in NT is often very complicated. So operators had formed and took over the land or even built warehouses, and they have been managing the site and letting them out in return for profits. Land resumption by the government will lead to direct losses for these operators. In theory, these investors have invested substantially on the land, so they should receive fair compensation. But these operators have been ignored by the government. The government is using compensation papers from 1988, which was almost 30 years ago, so it might be outdated. The Development Bureau has been telling us that they will carry out a feasibility study. When would the study be completed? We are talking about 2018. They seem to assume that the feasibility report will be passed and the operations can be moved inside. So is this really just from a procedure standpoint? And Mr. Tang Shiheng from Harvest Hill Hong Kong Limited, or Sam Kwun Limited. I have 2 points to make on the EGA arrangement. First of all, the operators in open areas can receive EGA. The maximum limit or payment ceiling is 5,000 square meters. This is unreasonable. When we talk about covered operations, we often talk about large-scale operations like timber work, machinery, etc. These equipment often occupy a large area of land. Right now, the payment ceiling is 5,000 square meters or 50,000 square feet. The ceiling is inadequate for these operators, or the cap is $1.95 million. Recently, Lands Department staff have been conducting pre-clearance surveys at the village, and some people have asked the Lands Department officers that if Company A is registered in the PCS, but after land resumption, Company B will not receive compensation, and the Lands Department staff confirmed that. A new operator has to invest substantial money in preparation at a new site. If they are not registered in the pre-clearance survey, they would not receive compensation later upon land resumption. So is this really fair to them? We hope that this can be clarified in the EGA arrangement. Mr. Yang Xiulun Good afternoon. I have the same concerns as other people. If my business at the lower village cannot fulfill the 10-year requirement, I cannot receive any EGA. So how can my business continue? Are there alternative proposals for the government to help operators who fall outside of the scope? I'd like to know whether the government has any measures to help us. Mr. Yang Xiuchang, I have nothing to say. I have no comments. Thank you. Mr. Yawa Chow. I have no comments. From the Democratic Party, Mr. Lau Kifeng. Thank you. The government is providing EGA for affected brownfield operators. I won't go into the details, but we have the following comments and concerns. We agree that it's reasonable to only grant EGA to operations who have been operating 10 years on brownfield sites, and or else the government will turn more agricultural land into brownfield sites, and there will be double benefits to brownfield operators. So this is a mechanism against abuse. In order to tackle the long-standing brownfield issues, it's inevitable that the government would encourage operators to move out. Even if the operators accept the compensation arrangement, some operators would like to continue their businesses. And without a clear reprovisioning plan from the government, for example, multi-story buildings, there have been objections from the trade. The relevant proposals do not provide enough incentive for operators to move out. The planning department is conducting relevant studies, which will be completed in 2018. Before results are available, the government is offering ex-gratia allowance, and the trade is concerned about reprovisioning arrangements, and the papers fail to assess the amount of brownfield sites which can be vacated. The government said that the relevant arrangements can smoothen the land resumption, but they are unable to assess the impacts of the relevant procedures.
And also how many operators intend to continue their operations. The DP thinks that there should be such a study earlier on, together with the Macho Long operators. We had a meeting, and they're very concerned about the issue of reprovisioning. In particular, they've been working there for generations, and therefore they hope that there can be reasonable relocation arrangements so that their family business can continue, and they would also face a lot of difficulties in identifying alternative sites for their operations. For example, in terms of application for licenses and so on, they have encountered a lot of difficulties, and they are willing to listen to the advice of the administration, and they are willing to move elsewhere. But then the administration should also offer help to them, for example, streamlining the procedures, or even having a coordinated approach adopted by different departments to facilitate their operations. So these are our views. Next, Mr. Lam Yet Leung. Thank you, Chairman. With regard to the operators affected by government development clearance projects, the administration is now offering this ex-gratia allowance, and we have the following views. Well, other than considering the years of operation, the amount of investment made should also be taken into account, including both hardware and software, and the number of employees and so on. And secondly, the business turnover of the year should also be considered. Well, as a member of the SME in Hong Kong, I think the administration should face up to those who have been operating there for a number of years. They are legitimate businessmen and they've made a lot of contribution to our economy. And if they have to move out, they might not be able to find cheap sites for their operations, and SMEs and the entire community will suffer. And therefore, to assist them to identify alternative sites for their operation would be the biggest and most proper compensation to be offered to them. So these are my views, and these are my remarks. Thank you. Next, from the New Territories Open Air Operators Association, Mr. Teng Kwan Sing. Thank you, Chairman. I'm representing the New Territories Open Air Warehouse Operators, and I'd like to express my views on behalf of the trade. Well, according to the paper uploaded by this council on the 25th of April this year, well, we had been there for more than 10 years under the short-term waivers, and also the MOT, the modification of tenancy permits, and also the letters of approval. If we had been there under those instruments for no less than 10 years, then we would be eligible for the EGA. And also, if we have had at least 10 years of operation in between the first registration to the and also the final registration date, then we would be eligible. This is most unreasonable, because for a particular company which has been operating for at least 10 years in a particular site, then this is no small company at all. So the administration has imposed this restriction on who would be eligible. This is not going to help the trade, nor can it help the operators. Because if 10 years would be the minimum period before one would be eligible, then it's next to zero that anybody would be eligible for the EGA. So the administration has to think twice about this. And also for the short-term tenancy, well, that's the land instrument offered to us by the administration for operating some short-term business on that site. And if you were to terminate those tenancies, then you are suggesting that we are unauthorized operators. Then what's the purpose of offering this EGA to us? I think it's a joke. Why don't you just tell us that you're not going to offer us any compensation at all? And there should be no eligibility criteria for the operators, and there should also not be any cutoff date. For example, if a particular company has been operating for 5 years and they are expanding their business, and therefore they will have to move elsewhere, and then someone else will have to come in, and as a result of that, if they are not eligible, then that would be grossly unfair to them. That's why we will be staunchly against it. And the trade is now asking the administration to identify an appropriate site so that all of us can move there. If that is the case, then even if you do not offer any allowance or compensation, it would be okay, because what we are asking for is to continue with our business operations rather than any compensation from the government. So the administration will have to think twice about this current offer. Next, Mr. Wong Chi-shui. Well, our company has been affected by the Anti-Northeast Development Plan, and we started our business in the 80s, and we moved there, and we were running this log factory industry or business, and as I told Mr. Chen, because of environmental concerns, we have already transformed ourselves, and as a result, the factory has been turned into something different, and we sublet our premises to other operators. Because we have changed the nature of business, we are no longer using the site for our own purposes, and we are no longer treated as the operator in situ, and that being the case, we are not eligible for the allowance, and that's grossly unfair to us. And also, if you look at the amount of compensation, because at the time when we were still running our log business, or timber business, well, we invested very heavily on the site. For example, for an electric crane, well, it would cost us some $700,000–800,000 in the 80s. So if you look at the compensation mechanism, the amount to be offered would be no different from those or that offered to other operator, and that's unfair. Yes, the administration might want to develop a particular area. We have no qualm about that. But then if for this purpose you're trying to stifle the incumbent operator or the interest of the landlord or landowner, then I hope that the panel and the administration will consider this more carefully. Last but not least, as many deputations have said, well, for those of us who have been operating there, actually what we want is to continue with our business so that our next generations can succeed our business or inherit our business. And if we can operate elsewhere, then please do consider that. Thank you. Okay, from the Macho Long Merchant Association Company Limited, Ms. Lam. In fact, I'd like to make 4 points today. As Mr. Wong just said, well, we are a group of operators who went to Macho Long in 1979. So we built the factory in the 1970s, and we only got the license in 1983. And as the administration banned the import of timber into Hong Kong, we have been forced to change the nature of business. Well, for the operators that are still there, well, in terms of the loss in the form of investment, we would only be compensated under the EGA mechanism, and we have no choice but to get it. So for the existing licensees and incumbent operators, I hope that the administration can differentiate them more appropriately. And also, the package was introduced some time ago and is no longer able to catch up with time. Because for the squatter registration exercise, because that was meant to be a squatter structure survey and the control of squatters. Well, the two are very different. In particular, for the operators in our area, well, we were only issued the license in the 80s, and we were only able to start our operation in 1983, and then in 1985, you did the squatter structure survey. So how could we be eligible? And also, you talk about the 10-year rule. And as many speakers have said, and I don't think I need to repeat their points. So, last but not least, under the existing EGA, well, the administration is looking at Wang Chau and also Hong Shui Kiu. But then, for those of us working in NT North, this would not be applicable because we do not have large holdings holding up the site, and we do not have large-scale open-air warehouses. As Mr. Leung Fok Yun just said, I think you should be looking at the merits of individual cases before deciding on the amount of allowance to be offered. And I also earnestly urge all members to look at the harsh conditions imposed by the administration. And there are also gray areas and loopholes, so you will have to look at the fine print before approving that. Thank you. Next, from Chun Lek Engineering Company Limited, Mr. Koo Chun Wing. Well, I'll be very succinct. Well, Chairman, just allow us to survive. Why do I say that? Because for the consultants that you've hired, when they come up with the recommendation on compensation, all right, well, it has to be a high rise as tall as the central center. But then, how can we be eligible? We've spent tens of billions of dollars on the warehouse, and you told us that if we had not been there for 10 years, then we would not be eligible. Okay, if you build a warehouse there, and if the house has to be torn down, and then you will have to move out, then how much would you be offered in the form of compensation? All right, Hong Kong claims to be a fair and just society, and yet you've been so harsh to us. The reason why I said that all we want is to continue to survive. All right, we are the pillars of Hong Kong's economy, and you want to resume land, and we would be prepared to allow you to resume land, but then you have so much land available in the fish ponds and also in the farmland. Why can't those be made available to us? So why have we existed in the first place? That's because we have nowhere to turn to, and we try to identify sites ourselves. How can you say that it's wrong? So we have done nothing wrong, Chairman, right? All we are trying to do is to support our families. So what wrong have we done? Next, Mr. Ma Ka-chun. Thank you, Chairman. Well, the Liberal Party basically welcomes the Development Bureau's EGA arrangements, because under the new arrangement, some brownfield sites operators will have a chance to apply for the EGA, and that would also represent a significant change. And they are also offering the allowance before resuming land. The operators will be able to continue with their operations, but then we are concerned that for many of the operators, because of the mandatory clearance plans, they would be affected. For example, for the logistics operators, or because of the nature of their site, they would need to have a large site before they can operate. And if the allowance does not take into account the replacement site that they would need, then these operators might be forced out of business. And therefore, the Liberal Party is of the view that the administration should extend the EGA, and they should also be prepared to look at the nature of operation in situ, and priority should also be given to those operators who had been operating there, and they might need more space, and the rent that they are paying right now might be quite low, and therefore the administration should help them identify alternative sites so that they can vacate their sites as early as possible. But then for the eligible or qualified operators, they will have to be there for at least 10 years, and this is quite a harsh term. And therefore, on the newly developed sites, we hope that EGA can be offered to them, but right now the maximum that they can get would be for a site of no more than 5,000 square meters. Well, in the new sites, despite the fact that there's no restriction, and you would be offering them with $110,000, and then they would only be able to get $2,500 per square feet. Would that be enough for them to identify a new site?
The government should assess whether the compensation levels are reasonable and adequate, and whether they can provide more compensation for certain trades or operators. Mr. Edishu proposed a motion, and it has been shared with members. This motion is similar as the one he moved last year, but the scope is slightly wider, and we will vote on the motion later. The plan was that the 33 deputations would have spoken by 4:30, and after that we will proceed. We will invite the government to provide a response. We hope that the discussions can wrap up at 4:30. For the discussion on the medical registration ordinance, we will have 30 to 40 members, and we need to elect the chairman at that meeting. If members agree, let's conclude the meeting by 4:30. Permanent Secretary. Permanent Secretary. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank the deputations for being here today and for sharing their views. I'd like to address certain issues. I won't repeat what's been said in the paper. As for whether the 10-year requirement is too long, the government's concern is that if the required period is too short, there is a possibility of abuse. If the time period requirement is too short, it would not be conducive to the effective use of the land. And in a meeting on 23rd of May, the Director of Lands said that if eligible squatter huts are to, for those staying in squatter huts, there's a 10-year requirement as well for EGA payment. As for the EGA levels or rates, our proposal is $390 per square meter. And this is based on private multi-story buildings. And the 15 month of rent is worth $2,310. And for open areas, is the percentage is about 1/6 at $390 per square meters. So that's the basis of our rates. And at a meeting on the 23rd of May, and Mr. Ma and Mr. Ling explained that for land lots of agricultural land, well, we have zones A to D. The land resumption methods depend on the zoning of the agricultural land. For Zone A, the price is about $1,100. The under the arrangement, EGA is given to operators. Some deputations talked about the presence of intermediaries. So I'd like to explain the government's logic in coming up with the arrangement. The provision of EGA serves to make up for inadequacies in the statutory compensation. EGA can be granted relatively quickly, and the requirement on the applicant is relatively less. That's why the arrangement cannot be overly complicated. If EGA is to cover the very complicated contractual relationships between the landlords and the users, the EGA arrangement will become too complicated. For intermediaries, they can still go down the path of statutory compensation. That process or that route is relatively more complicated. But for a sub-owner, the evidence required is relatively simple. They just need to produce the rental receipts to prove their losses. Some deputations talked about the need of reprovisioning upfront. The offering of EGA is different from the arrangements for brownfield sites. The offering of EGA serves to fill the void with statutory compensation. So EGA and brownfield sites are, well, they do not conflict with one another. If we have to wait for the study results of brownfield operations, then the provision of EGA would be delayed. To be honest, whether we can achieve one-to-one reprovisioning, for example, for every 100 square meters of land, can we provide another 100 square meters in return? The answer is no. For Hongshui Q, we have 190 hectares of brownfield operations at the moment. So this is an objective reality Hong Kong has to face, and I do not want to mislead anyone. One-to-one compensation or reprovisioning is not possible. For current brownfield operations, which can be rehoused, well, not all of them can be reprovisioned, but for those that can be reprovisioned, then we will put in the right financial arrangements for operations which cannot be reprovisioned. We are actively identifying other land, but not all brownfield operations can continue. I think it takes time to come up with a complete arrangement for brownfield operations. Yesterday, Mr. Chan has explained that by the end of this year, we hope to come back to LegCo to report our policy framework on brownfield sites. The Planning Department and CDD are both conducting studies on brownfield sites. The CDD is studying the feasibility of multi-story buildings, and results will be available next year. By then, we hope to share the results with LegCo, the trade, and the public. Finally, if Hong Kong is to move forward in terms of development, the new development area will not only be economically feasible, but it can offer facilities to the public. If we only carry out the developments after the multi-story buildings are in place, this is not realistic. Hong Kong cannot remain stagnant. Thank you. Deputy Chairman. Chairman, my family has a lot of land in the new territories. In order to, since the even though the definition of brownfield sites is not clear, I will not speak. Mr. Lam Shek Ting, Mr. Michael Lok. So as we carry out the Q&A, let's also deal with Ms. Eddie Chu's motion. Please raise your hands if you wish to speak. Leung Chi-Chung, Leung Kwok-Hong, Eddie Chu, Edward Yu. Does anyone else want to speak? Mr. Leung Kwok-Hong? Junius Ho, Regina Yip. Anyone else? We have 8 for a total of 32 minutes. And after that, we will deal with the motion. Let's make the best use of the time and not exceed 4 minutes each. Mr. Lam Shek Ting, thank you. In terms of the compensation policy, I understand the interests of a lot of operators are affected, but we also need to consider the fact that some brownfield operators occupied government land in an appropriate manner, and they carried out their operations. If they are being compensated, this is just unjust or unfair. We also received a request for help from the Ma Chau Loan Merchants Association. I received a letter from the association, and hopefully the government can meet the operators and in order to understand their challenges and talk about compensation arrangements. And when they want to be reprovisioned on private land, what measures would the government have? I received a letter today. They said the government said they have met the operators in February, but the new EGA arrangement was only in place afterwards. The government said that the development of Northwest NT is very important. Then the operators have made it very clear that they are willing to move out, and they would like to discuss with you how the process can be sped up, but you refuse even to meet them. So is it because Eric Ma will no longer be secretary soon, so he won't follow on this? Is this the case? They only had 3 minutes each. It's impossible for them to discuss their situations in depth. Some of them have already identified private land, and they needed to go through land use amendments via the planning department. So you should meet them so that you can help them speed up the process. Why did you say no to them? Mr. Lam, you talked about the macho loan merchants. If they want to know more about the procedures with the government, we would be happy to do so, but the government said they would not meet them. Are you aware of this? I cannot give you an answer at this point. But we are happy to communicate further. Thank you very much. Some merchants have identified private land and they would like to reprovision themselves there. But the reprovisioning is not that straightforward. They have to go through the town planning board, the fire services department, lands department, etc. Will you offer one-stop services for these merchants? So they won't have to approach different departments one by one. Well, you have 30 seconds left. Would you allow him to give you an answer? Mr. Wang? We can consider whether support can be given out. When you say one-stop services, it might sound rosy, but it might not be practical in reality. Well, we can talk to brownfield operators, but in terms of rural or environmental protection or planning factors, I think it's hard to give a straightforward answer. Mr. Michael Loh, I'd like to talk about Mr. Eddie Chu's motion, and it will be hard for me to support it. Mr. Chu has made an amendment. He is not being environmentally friendly, but the principle is still the same, right? Mr. Chu always talks about giving priority to brownfield sites. So he made it sound like that after the brownfield sites are recovered or resumed, all the problems would go away. And Mr. Chu asked for in situ reprovisioning, and that enough land should be given to the operators. I'm not against in situ reprovisioning, but based on what Mr. Chu has said in the past, I think he's conflicting himself.
And we simply don't understand why he has put forth such a proposal, because he's simply contradicting himself. In fact, if you really insist on in situ land exchange, that might not be possible unless we can be like Jesus. We had 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread, so that we can have castle in the air, and then we'll be able to redistribute it in situ. In terms of identifying site for housing development and for other developments, priorities have to be set. Well, as to whether or not certain operators can go into buildings and so on, well, there is a lot of room for discussion. And for brownfield site compensation, yes, there is a lot of room for enhancement, and whether or not they should be there for at least 10 years before they are eligible for the allowance. Well, some of them might not have been there for 10 years, and if as a result of that they are not eligible, then there is room for further discussion. So the administration might need to enhance the package in order to make things smooth, so that those affected, whether they are landlords or operators, they would be prepared to accept it. And then in terms of land supply, in particular housing land supply, we've been looking for that for a long time, and therefore I hope that the whole process can be smoothened. Well, for the brownfield site operators, can I ask the administration for the compensation package, can you adopt a more relaxed approach? Thank you. Mr. Wong, well, thank you for the question. Today we have heard the valuable comments from the deputations. I'm not able to answer you right away. We will have to go back and then we will have to look at all the views before we finalize our views, and if we are able to come up with a revised package in the fourth quarter, we will have to come back to this council to brief you on our latest position, and if there is no room for further maneuvering, then we'll be explaining why in the fourth quarter. So that's the only thing that I can say for the time being. Okay, no further follow-up. Next, Professor Edward Yu. Thank you, Chairman. I think you're turning something good into something bad, because initially you're trying to increase the EGA. That should have been something good, and you should have won some applause. And yet, from what we have heard, apparently there are a lot of grievances, thinking that the package is not fair. I think the crux of the matter is that initially, well, under our land policy, well, you have this EGA arrangement for the landowner, and then the landlord in turn would be responsible for compensating their tenants or occupiers in order to ensure that the administration will be able to recover the land. But then the administration is trying to be more lenient so that for the operators they would also be eligible. The administration is hoping that the whole process can be expedited. So that should have been something good. But then apparently what has happened is that there are certain gray areas. Well, for the landowners, if you want to upgrade it to Cat A farmland, then they'll be able to get about $1,100 per square meter. So that should be sufficient incentive for the brownfield site operators, right? And yet, under the current proposal, you're only discussing the compensation to be offered to the operators. And as a result, that might lead to an increase in the overall spending by the administration for this. Well, is it possible for the administration to submit the details of this proposal? For example, how much will be offered to the landowner and how much will be offered to the operator on the site? Are you going to reduce the amount given to the landlord so that some can be left for the operators, or are you going to enhance both in order to expedite the whole process? So what are you going to do? Yes, Permanent Secretary, thank you for the question. With regard to the allowance to be offered to the landlord under the current arrangement, that will continue. We have not touched on that. For example, if you're an owner of a Cat A farmland, so you will still be eligible for the $1,100 per square meter. So the arrangement is targeting the operators on the site. As for the details, I'm not going to repeat them, but then it's not a zero-sum game. So it doesn't mean that for one party, he'll be getting more and therefore the other party will be getting less. It's not like that. Okay? In other words, the Treasury will have to pay more. So that should have been something good, right? So you're talking about existing brownfield operators, whether they are the landlords or the operators on the whole, they'll be able to get more, right? So what is your assessment? How come, despite the fact that the administration is offering more to the affectees, so that the operators would actually get more? But then from what you've heard today, well, the unanimous view expressed today is that they are not happy with the arrangement. So according to your understanding, what's the reason? Well, there are 2 points, Chairman. On government's expenditure, will it go up? Well, that's not the way I put it, because we've repeatedly emphasized that under the current arrangement, this is not going to replace the statutory compensation. So, of course, that would be more complicated. In other words, if the applicant goes for statutory compensation, if he can meet the criteria, then he will still be eligible. So we are not comparing like with like. And also you talk about the response. I think I can kind of understand it because for those who are trying to get the compensation, of course, they are always striving for more. But then that's indisputable. But then on our part, we have to ensure that public money is spent properly. Mr. Eddie Yu, please think twice before you submit any motion, because it would be environmentally unfriendly, and you're also wasting the time and effort of the Secretariat. This is not the first time. So I hope that next time when you do the same thing, you will have to think twice before you do it. Chairman, I'm trying to. Am I supposed to explain my motion, or am I going to respond to your remarks? I think you will have to deal with it within your 4-minute slot. Okay. I don't understand why Lok Chung Hong said that I was contradicting myself, because I was proposing that we should adopt the brownfield site first and then greenfield and then green belt site later. I think it's not contradictory at all. In fact, we are talking about a series of policies that have to be more coordinated, because if you do not think in terms of that, then the outcome will be that, okay, whether it's Wang Chao or Hong Shui Kiu, in fact, the operators there will definitely want to continue with their business. And if you do not think or put yourselves in their shoes, then that will only cause problems, because they will have to identify new farmland or other fish ponds and so on, so that they can relocate their business. That's not what we would like to see. And therefore, what I'm thinking about is that, well, we may have different values. All right, we have to protect the environment. We also have to safeguard other people's livelihood. That's the administration's duty. But then, from what the Permanent Secretary just said, I found that disappointing, because he's just talking about compensation, and also he's just talking about some changes in planning and so on. Apparently they cannot go in tandem. You're just coming up with a package which everybody is not happy with, but then you said that well, it's not possible for you to offer them with compensation that is of equal value. We are not asking for that at all. Well, for example, in Hong Shui Kiu, if you're able to conduct a freezing survey in Hong Shui Kiu, and then you'll be able to know exactly how many operators can move elsewhere, how many have to close their business, then we'll be able to tell how many operators can be relocated in situ. This should have been something that you should come up with ready data. All right, we are talking about some imminent projects. One is Wang Chao and one is Hong Shui Kiu. So when will you be able to come up with the statistics of the operators, and how many of them can be relocated, how many cannot, and how many sites will be needed? When can you come up with such data? Permanent Secretary, thank you, Mr. Chu, for your question. Well, today we are discussing whether or not we should be offering EGA. And as I explained, we should not wait until after the completion of those studies. Because for brownfield site studies, the Planning Department is conducting a territory-wide study, and the Lands Department would also be looking at multi-story buildings, whether or not those can be used by these brownfield site operators. Mr. Eddie Chu, I'd like to ask the Secretariat this, because just now there's a Mr. Kong. He made a very important point. He said that many operators on brownfield sites might be from the logistics industry, and then for the new operators, they might have invested more heavily in those sites, and you're using this 10-year rule. This is something that will not be able to tie in with the needs of the industry. Permanent Secretary, whether or not there is room for adjustment for the 10-year rule, well, we are not in a position to answer that yet. The reason why we have suggested that we should have this 10-year rule, I've already explained that. And also for the arrangement itself, it has to be more simple by nature. That's the need. Or else, why do we not go for the statutory compensation? And if they can prove their status, then maybe statutory compensation might be an easier way out for them. But then I don't want to speculate their intentions. Yes, Mr. Leung, I'm in favor of the territory-wide brownfield site study. But then in terms of timing, that might not be able to tie in with the current allowance. But then if you can come up with a comprehensive policy before you introduce the compensation package, that might be better. Because that would be able to cater for different scenarios. Looking at the current proposal by the administration, well, just now we have heard from the deputations. Many of them are of the view that the package just looks at the need for land resumption without looking at other factors, and there are many things that the deputations do not understand. For example, even the permanent secretary said that well, the 10-year rule might leave something to be desired, and also why the restriction on the 5,000 square meter. Because in Hong Shui Kiu, there are some operators whereby the site would be larger than 5,000 square meters. It could be up to 20, 30,000 square meters. So how would you deal with them? Because they will simply not be happy with the allowance that you offer. So by adopting this approach, Permanent Secretary, if you think there is room for further negotiation, then you should maintain a constructive dialogue with the operators, or else there would be an outcry from the operators. So that is something that you will have to consider. Chairman, shall I also comment on the motion to be moved by Mr. Eddie Chu? Would you like the administration to respond first? Well, I'll just share my views first. I'm not really strongly against it, because I think it has all the good intention, but then it sounds somewhat hypocritical, because he has been criticizing the government's policy on brownfield sites, and he's in favor of scrapping it altogether. But now, apparently, he's trying to defend the interests of the operators. That would be against the policy. That's why I'm not in a position to vote against it, but then I think he's not just contradicting himself, he's also hypocritical. But then on the room for maneuvering, and also the dialogue to be kept with the trade, what is the government going to do? Permanent Secretary, well, on the room for maneuvering, as I said earlier, well, today I'm not in a position to say whether or not the policy would be fine-tuned. Why 5,000 square meters? Because one of the considerations is that we don't want to give rise to further abuses, and we'll go back and consider the views expressed today. And then in the fourth quarter, when we come back to this council again, if there is to be any adjustment, we'll explain why. And if there is no adjustment, then we'll also explain why.
Next, Mr. Leung Kwok-hong, Chairman. Well, Mr. Di Chu was not contradicting himself, and the priority is brownfield sites over greenfields. So, of course, the brownfield operators do not want to be bothered, but we are not chasing them out. We are just trying to use the brownfield sites more effectively for your territory-wide brownfield survey. Well, if your lungs have issues, you would not check or examine your entire body. You would, of course, focus on your lungs. So the priority is in Wangchao and Hong Shui Kiu. So if you are coughing, you would naturally want to check your lungs first. If you can find out how many brownfield sites there are, as well as their conditions, then you can. There's a chance you can deal with it. Some of them can be rehoused or relocated in situ. For operators who want to move to private land, will you allow them to do so? And certain factors might affect the ecology of the operations, but you refuse to do either of those, and you blame us for trying to work on the brownfield sites. Mr. Wong, were you looking at someone else's land use information rather than Hong Kong's? Give me a reason why you refuse to work with the brownfield sites in Wang Chau and Hong Shui Kiu. They are imminent. So I'll give you 10 seconds. Why can't you do that? Permanent Secretary, thank you very much for the question. I want to stress again that the EGA doesn't just apply to certain areas like Hong Shui Kiu or Wang Chau. So you are talking about compensation today. There are operators who want to continue, but you are talking about something else. At least you should give those operators a chance. But you didn't. You said that the EJ arrangement would not replace statutory compensation. So what Mr. Lam Cheuk Ting said was right. The government has always been talking about money, including EGA and compensation. That's how you look at it, but that's not the case in the eyes of others. So what are you going to do? You are blaming us, and we are criticized as being hypocritic. So why don't you visit those brownfield sites? So just give us a yes or no. In my constituency, a furniture store could not be reprovisioned elsewhere, even though they identified the land already. But the treatment for the property developers have been different. Are you going to ask them to surrender their land? Of course, you won't dare to do so. The developers are making money. Would you dare take away their sites? Dr. Junius Ho. Chairman, I support extending the current EGA arrangement to open warehouses, and according to the application number 22 PD, the government already gave their stance, and today we are talking about EGA. I will address Eddie Chiu's motion later. First of all, under the new arrangement, there is a 10-year operation requirement. The deputations support the extension of the EGA to outdoor warehouse operators, but the 10-year requirement is rather strict. Can you relax it to, say, 5 years? You talked about preventing abuse and so on, but we already have a town planning policy or town planning ordinance in place, so I don't think that would be a concern. If we relax the requirement to, say, 5 years, that would be more appropriate. You talked about compensation levels for open warehouses without contraventions. I can tell you that 99.5% of the cases have contraventions if you resort to the buildings ordinance, so I don't think it's necessary. I'm not even talking about the SCT sites. If you remove that restriction, I think a lot of people can benefit. The current ratio of 1 to 6 is unreasonable. I think it would be better to adjust the ratio to 1 to 3. And for Class A land, 1,100 or 75 or 25% for other classes. You explained the calculations using market rent. I think the ratio of 1 to 6 can be adjusted. since you are implementing this policy already, you should not adopt 1 to 6. You should really try to help the operators. As for the maximum payment ceiling of 5,000 square meters for very big operations, I think having a payment ceiling of 5,000 square meters is too rigid. You are not imposing any limits on the areas of the workshops. So you should not impose a maximum payment ceiling. And this would help operators reprovision their operations. Permanent Secretary. As I said, I cannot offer a definitive response. The government has to consider all the possibilities. Thank you. I have made very specific suggestions, and hopefully you can consider them. As to Eddie Chu's application, in principle, I see no problem with it, so I would not object to it or support it. Ms. Edward Lau. Thank you. As for the brownfield sites within the new development area, I have discussed this with operators in the area. Like other members, we are concerned about their livelihoods. Many of them cannot retire yet, and they have to continue to do business. I think we are looking at two issues. Some of the current compensation plans are rather complicated. I think you can streamline the process to in order to allow operators to get compensation. As for land resumption and reprovisioning arrangement, that is another issue altogether. So compensation and reprovisioning should not be linked. If you are just streamlining the EJ arrangements, I would be supportive. But trying to discuss and help the stakeholders one by one is something you need to continue to do. So can the Permanent Secretary address that? Mr. Wong, we have heard Mr. Lau's suggestion, and we will do our best in communicating with stakeholders. At Northeast NT, the issue is imminent. For the creation of a new post at the Development Bureau, it was about the study on brownfield sites in Hong Shui Kiu, and before the study is completed, the land resumption might have been completed already. In the past, you have met Macho Long or the North District Chamber of Commerce. I hope you can arrange more meetings to follow up on the issues. Can the Permanent Secretary commit to that? Mr. Wang? Based on need, we can arrange meetings with the merchant associations you mentioned. I'm not against streamlining the process or arrangement, but as for land resumption and reprovisioning, I think we should sit down and see how to go about it. Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Thank you. The EGA only applies to conditions or areas not covered in the past. there's not much we have to discuss. But in terms of developing the logistics trade or dealing with various operations on brownfield sites, what will be the arrangements? When we demolished the squatter huts, the key was not compensation but reprovisioning. From this paper, we could not see the government's policy and measures on this issue. For Hong Shui Kiu or Northeast NT development, have any reprovisioning arrangements of people or operations been confirmed? The problem has snowballed because in Hong Shui Kiu we are talking about 800 hectares of land, which means the entire Hong Shui Kiu area is incorporated, and the same goes for Northeast New Territories. Has the government considered suitably reducing the scale of development or of the developments? This way, you would develop just enough, or else the scope of development will be beyond the capability of the government. Permanent Secretary, thank you very much. As Mr. Wu said, the scope of the EJ arrangement is relatively narrow. Given the reality of Hong Kong, one-to-one reprovisioning of the land is not possible for Hong Shui Kiu. We are talking about 190 hectares of brownfield sites. And we could only find 60 hectares of land for backup operations. So reprovisioning might not be the best word. We need to identify suitable sites in Hong Kong to provide for the brownfield operations. In terms of infrastructure, well, it's too early to call. By the fourth quarter this year, hopefully we can have a policy on brownfield sites, and we can report that to LETCO. And there are two major studies. One is by the CDD on multi-story buildings and hopefully can accommodate brownfield operations, and the planning department is also conducting a territory-wide brownfield operation, and results should be out by 2018. They can help our work. And whether we can minimize the impact caused to various districts, we have to wait until the surveys are completed. Ms. Abramshak, I did not intend to ask questions, but
for ex-gratia payments, that would provide an incentive for those operators who are operating there. And mention was made about Hong Shui Kiu. I don't want the issue involving Hong Shui Kiu to be brought up here, because often a time, as soon as the administration makes the announcement, they would have thought that they have resolved the problem already. In fact, at the development panel, they would be briefing us about the details. I think there has been no consultation whatsoever about Hong Shui Kiu, and if you try to extend that from Hong Shui Kiu to elsewhere, then it would sound as if the administration is going to resume land all over the territory. So what are the criteria for offering this ex-gratia allowance? Can you elaborate a little more? Well, Chairman, the reason why we brought up Hong Shui Kiu, as the Honourable Member just said, we are not discussing Hong Shui Kiu here, so please do not assume that we have already briefed you on what we are going to do with Hong Shui Kiu. On the framework for compensation, first of all, we will have to decide on it first, because we have to do the pre-clearance registration. So the paper says that the cutoff date would be 10 years, and we will have to conduct the freezing survey before we can tell. And there is a mechanism available so that, under the block vote system, we need to come to this council to apply for that vote. Well, Chairman, even if you apply to this council for funding, you will have to make an estimate on how much you need every year, because you have to have plans in place first. How much land will have to be resumed and how much will be required to be offered as compensation. So you will have to do an estimate. So that's number one. And I'm pleased that you said that you would become the bureau director. I hope that you would not just be making casual promises, because the incumbent government is best at doing this. That is, whenever they say something, it would be as if they have done it already. So you will have to tell us exactly how much you're going to spend on it. Well, Chairman, if you look at the criteria, before we clear the site, we will have to carry out a freezing survey, and at present we simply don't have the data. For example, how many operators have been there for how many years, and whether or not they would be eligible for the allowance under our plan, because they have to fulfill certain criteria, so we can't tell yet. But then shortly before the clearance, when we really implement certain projects, we will definitely conduct that sort of survey, and we will come to this council for funding. Chairman, compensation is a very complicated matter, because I have a lot of experience here, because I used to be the Land Development Corporation's member, and therefore for those whose business is going to be affected, you should be more generous, or else there might be unnecessary conflicts, because everybody would like to get more in the form of compensation. And you will also have to make sure that you would be using public money properly. That's why negotiation has to take place. All right, for those who have just joined us, I said that we'd like to adjourn the meeting by 4:30, because there is another Bills Committee meeting next door on medical registration, and they would need 30-40 people in order to make a quorum. But then I simply cannot entertain all of you, and we do not have a quorum right now, and we will need to have a quorum before we can vote on Mr. Eddie Chew's motion. So that would take 5 minutes for the bell to be rung. Mr. Frankie Yik. We asked for this public hearing, and of course we have our reasons, and the administration has come up with this revised package with expedited procedures and so on, and of course that's good. And Mr. Eddie Chu is also asking for in situ reprovisioning and so on. As many deputations have said, all they want is not compensation, but rather they'd like to stay and operate, and therefore we have been saying that we should relocate them before we carry out the clearance operations. If indeed you will have to resume land for the clearance operations, number one, I think the 10-year rule is not reasonable. It's a very rigid approach, and you can also ask the deputation to explain. Mr. Frankie Yik, you should not be asking the deputations to elaborate, because we have to deal with the motion and also the entire meeting. All right, in Hong Shui Kiu, the reason why many people have gone to Hong Shui Kiu, that's because in 2007, because of the commissioning of the Western Corridor, many have moved into the brownfield sites there, and now you have adopted the 10-year rule, and as a result of that, many people might not be able to meet that requirement, and that's not fair. And also for the 80-90 hectares of land in Hong Shui Kiu, initially they might have operated on a smaller scale, but then subsequently they might have moved to the adjoining site, and as a result they might not be eligible, and yet they've taken their roots in Hong Shui Kiu, and therefore the way you draw the line might cause some unfairness to them. And also in the paper you talk about the landlord. Yes, you're going to offer compensation to them, and for those who are operating there, you would also be offering them removal allowance. But then what about the eligible structure? He might be a subtenant, because this is rural land, and very often there would be a contractor who might have negotiated with a landlord, and subsequently he might have sublet some of the land to other people, and you're now telling them that, sorry, we have only registered the landlord, but then what about the subtenant? He doesn't enjoy any status at all, and therefore he's not eligible. So that's unfair. I hope that you've listened to the views expressed by the trade, and you should seriously sit down with them to sort out the whole thing, so that that would be fairer to them. Ultimately, all we want is to give them a replacement site so that they can continue with their business. That's all we want. Thank you. Permanent Secretary, any response? Yes, we will go back and consider those views very carefully. Okay? I've received the notification from Mr. Chu that he intends to move a motion. I'm not going to read that out because we don't have a quorum right now. But then in terms of the wording, I'm sure you all have it with you. And it's also directly related to the agenda item. As we do not have a quorum right now, I'll ask the Secretary to ring the bell. All right, the motion moved by Mr. Chu, Mr. Eddie Chu, is to ensure that the logistics industry will not be affected by the new development plan, and in order to avoid the expansion of brownfield sites occupation, the panel asked the administration to insist on this in situ relocation principle, so that sufficient land can be set aside in a new development area, and infrastructure should also be provided so that the affected operators can be relocated and continue with their operation at affordable rents. Thank you.
同事們，同事們。
Colleagues, we have to put it to the vote shortly, so I'll be asking you to raise your hands instead of pressing the button because not all of you are seated in your designated seats. So I'll be inviting you to raise your hands if you are in support of the motion, and then the secretary will count the votes accordingly.
OK， 請
Okay, will those in support of Mr. Eddie Chu's motion please raise your hands? Thank you. Please do not raise both hands because you'll be confusing me. Okay, 14 of you. Thank you. Hands down, please. Those who are against, please raise your hands. Abstentions? All right, the motion is carried. 14 in favor, 6 abstentions, none against. Okay, thank you, deputations, for coming. Without further ado, our meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.